And thanks to the New School, thanks to Jasmine and to Kate at the New School for arranging our event tonight, and to Postman Books, who are outside selling copies of not just the new book, but also all of our panelists have written superb books, and they're all on sale outside. Thanks to C-SPAN, who are here filming this event tonight. Also, I'd like to thank Dennis Moynihan of Democracy Now!, who was very helpful in arranging this. And Sarah Bartel of Penguin Press is here, and she is the editor without whom this book would be much less readable and accessible. So we're here tonight because this book, The Myth of American Idealism, was released yesterday. I co-authored it with Professor Noam Chomsky. It was one of the highlights of my life, my writing life. But unfortunately, during the process, near the end of putting this book together with Professor Chomsky, his health declined and he is unable to continue making public appearances. So when the book came out, when it finally came out, we thought, well, one thing we could do is we could convene a panel of people who are intimately familiar with his life and work to talk about it and talk about why they find his contributions so valuable. I just want to say why, for me personally, what that is. Just to give you a little bit of the background here, I run this magazine, Current Affairs. You can subscribe outside if you like. We have a special discount for people who have attended this event. We're an independent, non-profit lefty magazine. We're very inspired by the work of Noam Chomsky, who I was introduced to in high school. Someone gave me a copy of Failed States, and I had the experience that a lot of people have when they first encounter Chomsky, which is, I think you would describe it as kind of eye-opening. What he did, in addition to being one of the most cited scholars in cognitive science and linguistics of all time, what he did in the realm of politics and foreign policy was to meticulously expose propaganda and mythology, and to do so in a way that really, really deeply challenges a lot of what we're taught. And it's eye-opening because he, using incredible forensic analysis and deep factual research, it exposes a lot of the things that we might assume to be true and that we hear are true as not being true. And it can be a very disturbing experience. I think this book, I keep accidentally telling people I hope you enjoy the book and then realizing that the book isn't that enjoyable. I hope you find the book valuable is what I've started saying now, because I think that's the truth, is that I think that what Chomsky does is he shows us the world as it really is, and it's a very dark picture often. It can be a hopeful picture because it celebrates the work of activist movements, but it shows that there are many horrors in this world and many crimes committed by our own government that we often don't face up to. And so I was lucky enough, John Halley, who's in the room, introduced Professor Chomsky to Current Affairs, so he's set off the chain of events that led to this book and therefore this event. And as a result, Professor Chomsky subscribed to our magazine, and then would complain to me personally when the magazine did not arrive. Which was great. On one hand, it was embarrassing, because he would say, the journal is not here. And could you please send it? So as many of you, I'm sure, have corresponded with Professor Chomsky at some point in your life. He's famously open to interacting with anyone, had a very egalitarian approach to people. And so I struck a correspondence with him. I interviewed him a couple times for the magazine, which was an incredible experience. And then I got really bold, and I asked him at one point, would you be willing to collaborate on a book project? And he said yes. And so we went back and forth with drafts. And what I really wanted to do, and the reason I asked him, is because, as I said, I find his message, his critique, so important, so challenging, and I wanted a new generation of readers to be exposed to it, to have something that really very powerfully summed up his thoughts on a number of topics. So the book goes through his analysis of media, it goes through lots of different regions of the world, and sort of shows how things are. So I want to talk today with our panelists about Professor Chomsky's life and work, why they find it valuable, their interactions with him. So we are joined today by first Bev Stoll, who ran Professor Chomsky's office at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for over 20 years. Authored a delightful blog about her experiences in Professor Chomsky's office, and a memoir, Chomsky and Me, which is available outside, available from or books. And so you pick that up, check that out. Victor Picard of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. Victor is a leading analyst of the media. He's the author of America's Battle for Media Democracy and Democracy Without Journalism. We are also joined by Greg Grandin. He is a historian at Yale University, the author of a number of books, including Kissinger's Shadow, Empire's Workshop, Fordlandia, and End of the Myth, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And finally, we are joined by Amy Goodman, the host of Democracy Now!, perhaps America's leading independent news program since 1996. Amy Goodman is the author of 6 books and the winner of the Gandhi Peace Award and the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalism. So please welcome our wonderful panel. So Bev,
yes.
We're going to start with you. If everyone just make sure to speak directly into the mic so we can capture everything here. So Bev, tell us about when you first came to work in Professor Chomsky's office. You entered a world that I think of as Chomsky World, and it was a remarkable experience. Tell us a little bit about Chomsky World.
Okay. So it was not
Can you split that up?
I have to turn it on?
Yeah.
Testing.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was supposed to be my easy job because I was going off to finish a master's degree in psych. But somebody interviewed me. It was actually John's father, Morris, interviewed me. So I didn't even know Noam until my 3rd day of work. It was like an arranged marriage. What if if we don't get along? What will happen? But it was a weird place. I had worked at MIT running graduate student programs, and I walked in here and I said, "Where am I? This is not MIT." It was like this old throwback. I don't like to say that they put the old renegade professors in this old building 20 that was pretty much ready to fall over. So I looked around and I said, what is this artwork? What is this person? But I was only going to stay 2 years to do my master's, and there was El Salvadorian priest heads cut off, held by a grim reaper, and there were bronze miners talking about the Chilean miners who were I learned this stuff over years, and I used to kind of clean everything off and not really look at it, So I knew I was in a different world. This was not my world. Yeah, and there was a poster of Palestine with a big X through it saying, "Return to sender, no longer here."
And a lot of books, right? The cover of your book is a drawing of all of the overflowing literature.
Stacks of books, stacks of papers, stacks in his office, outside the office, in another room down the street. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, Professor Chomsky is kind of famous for the level of his activity. Not only revolutionizing linguistics, but producing, hundreds of books on politics, all of the correspondence with the public. Can you tell us a bit about his kind of day-to-day work?
Day to day and night to night. I think he went to sleep at 3 a.m. maybe. I don't know if you've ever gotten a call from him, Amy, at 1 a.m., but our librarian did when he couldn't figure something out. And at the end she said, "Do you know what time it is?" He said, "No." It was 1:30 in the morning by the time they finished. And then he started working again at 8. And in fact, he told me that if he had a problem with something, he even worked while he was sleeping. So he would put that issue in his head and say, okay, this is a problem I want to work out, and then I'm going to go to sleep, and in the morning, in fact, he lost his car once after an event because he was so deep in thought. In fact, I should tell you that when you meet Noam, it's not him until he arrives fully into his body because his mind is somewhere else. And he left a place once, couldn't find his car, went home and said, okay, that's my problem, I'm putting it in my mind. And in his sleep he saw 2 street signs, and that's where he found his car the next day.
And tell us just a little bit about his interactions with the public, because you write in your book about the wide range of people who came through that office.
We had about 1,000 emails a day.
Plus letters.
Plus letters, yeah. Letters, we had letters back then. He was nothing but kind, nothing but compassionate, nothing, but he was a real thing. There was a time, and I'm going to throw Amy under a little bus here, if you don't mind. But Amy, many times when Noam was really busy going to New York, and he'd say, oh, so sorry, tell Amy. And I think it was a big act, by the way. He made me think that he was going to do it. So he said, tell Amy I can't do her show when I'm there. I'm just too exhausted. And Amy, he would come back and say, Amy kidnapped me again. So I knew it was a bunch of baloney because he couldn't be kidnapped. But there was a time when they gave a talk. I'll never forget this, and this is how he affects other people. We were in Harvard Square. Laura and I were there, and Amy and Noam had given a talk to some students at Harvard. And we walked back from Noam Penn, which had all of these glass windows, and people were going by doing a double take. And this young man came in, he was a father, he had his little girl with him, and he saw Noam and Amy, and he started to cry. And I cry every time I think about this. And he said, I just wanted to thank the 2 of you. He said to his daughter, these are the two of the most important people who want to save our democracy and find peace for us. And he introduced them to his daughter, and she shook their hand. And Laura and I, of course, were crying, because I cry all the time. My book is all about crying. And at the very end, not to give it away, but I burst into tears.
Amy, I would love it if you could tell us how you first encountered Noam Chomsky.
Well, it was actually before I was born, because my parents and Noam went to camp together, grew up together. It was a place called Mossad, not to be confused with Mossad. It was a Hebrew-speaking camp, and my dad and Noam were bunkmates. My dad would always say to me later, how's Noam Chomsky? Have you talked to him recently? They only spoke Hebrew at the camp, so that my parents, their whole lives, spoke Hebrew to each other. And my mom would describe how she would see over the horizon would come Noam's father, who was a Hebraist, who was a Hebrew linguist, and how distinguished he looked when he was coming to visit Noam. There's a bit of a funny story. My father had always described me how Noam in Color War or something met him. And so I don't know, someone told this story, and I was in London interviewing Russell Brand for the hour of Democracy Now! And he sat down and we got to talk, and he said, is it true that Noam Chomsky bit your father? I said, oh my God, we're on the air. And so then, because another journalist heard this in the United States, they asked Noam this question. Noam called me and said, how could you possibly say that? I said, no, we're going to change it. I'm going to say, you were Noam, my father would describe to me in camp as his bunkmate with biting criticism.
Okay. So, but wait, can you clarify? Is it true that Noam Chomsky bit your father?
I cannot confirm it. But anyway, it was wonderful to know Noam for all of these years.
Can you tell us a little bit about your exposure to his work? Obviously, the work that you do at Democracy Now! is kind of deeply influenced and aligned with his kind of analysis of the world. Can you talk about that?
Well, I was going back to the first interviews I did with Noam, and Democracy Now! Is 28 years old. Back in 1996, the first year, the Prime Minister of Israel, I think his name was Benjamin Netanyahu at the time, was giving an address to a joint session of Congress at the time. And we called Noam and had a conversation about Clinton, Netanyahu, and the joint address to Congress. Isn't that remarkable? In fact, Noam would often say he was invited around the world to give speeches, and these were scheduled years in advance. And when they would say, can we have a title, he always knew he was safe to say, the crisis in the Middle East. The current crisis in the Middle East. But I would say, in addition to all the different issues we discussed with Noam, I mean, finding him, Beth, talking to you so many times to try to book interviews with him, tracking him down, whether he was in Berkeley, California. I remember we needed to talk to him. We figured out he was in Berkeley. I had some contact on a press release. I saw a phone number and called that number. And clearly they were in a car. I could hear Noam's voice. I said, could you put Noam on the phone? Noam, can you join us tomorrow morning? It would be at, what, democracy knows at 8, at 5 in the morning. I said, that would be perfect. I can't imagine you have something else planned. Or calling him once in Turkey when he went to stand with a publisher who was going to prison for publishing his work. And Noam wanted to be with him in court. And when we heard this, we called him. And I think he said, it is 4 in the morning. I said that would be, again, a perfect time to have this conversation. But I think among the ways he had the greatest effect, aside from personally, how important he was in his analysis of the world was around East Timor. For us. I first went to East Timor in 1990. I went with my colleague, great journalist, Alan Nairn. I was actually going to Guam to cover a case between a mother and a daughter. The mother was a legislator, the daughter was a lawyer, and she was suing her mother because her mother was going to try to outlaw abortion. And why this was interesting to the United States, because it was a Catholic territory, was that this case could go to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a U.S. territory, and it could overturn, years ago, Roe v. Wade. This was in 1990. And so going there, we thought, oh, that is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from this place that Noam Chomsky has written about for years, East Timor. So could go from Guam, if it was possible, to get into East Timor. Because Noam never let the story of East Timor die. No matter what else he was writing about, he would bring up East Timor. And I think this educated people all over the world. So we went to East Timor in 1990, and then back in 1991. I mean, Timor, was a Portuguese colony for many, many years. Then Portugal, when it disbanded its empire in 1974, East Timor was going to become, at the time, the newest nation in the world, except that Indonesia then invaded. It was actually Noam's birthday, December 7th. December 7th, 1975. But they didn't invade until they were able to meet with then President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. They came to Jakarta, met with Suharto, gave the go-ahead for the invasion, because Suharto was afraid if he invaded East Timor and was getting weapons from the United States, they would cut off the weapons flow. Kissinger and Ford assured him that the relationship would continue. They flew off to meet with another dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, and Indonesia invaded East Timor, the small half-island nation, by land, by air, and by sea. 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. The Indonesian army, the 4th largest in the world, was trained, financed, and armed by the United States. And from December 7th, 1975, until 1999, Indonesia committed one of the great genocides of the late 20th century, killed off 1/3 of the population of East Timor. I learned this all from Noam. So we went in 1990, and then in 1991 went back, because we heard for the first time ever the UN was going to send a delegation to East Timor. And we thought this is a critical moment to see what would happen. And we went in October of 1991, fully armed with all the information Noam had been writing about for so long, as well as writings of the Timorese themselves and their testimonies, those who got out. And when we got there, we went to the main church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, and we heard that the Indonesian military had surrounded the church. They shot a young man who had taken refuge there. And the next day was the funeral. 1,000 Timorese marched to the Santa Cruz Cemetery. And because they expected the delegation to come, everyone dropped out of their schools, their homes. This is what happened with this young man, because they wanted to be protected, be in the churches of Timor, so that they wouldn't be arrested before they could talk to the delegation. Then we learned that UN canceled the delegation at behest of the United States. And it was November 12th, as we covered people deciding to march anyway through the streets of Dili to the Santa Cruz Cemetery. The Indonesian military, armed with US M16s, marched down the street as thousands of Timorese had bravely gone to the cemetery to honor the young people who had been buried there. And the Indonesian military opened fire, gunning people down from right to left, killing more than 250 Timorese on that day. It was one of, actually, not even the worst massacres in East Timor. We continued to cover it through those years. They beat us up that day. They lined up in firing squad fashion to go after Alan and I. But we were able to get out because we said that we were from the same country their weapons were from. If they killed us, they would have to pay a price for killing us. They understood they never had to pay for killing the Timorese. And this is something we clearly understood from all that Noam had taught us about. We covered East Timor for many years, and in 1999, the UN sponsored a referendum for the people of East Timor to decide whether they wanted to be a part of Indonesia or to be an independent nation. And we tried to get in to cover this referendum. I was detained twice and deported. Alan made it through. As the people of East Timor voted, Indonesia burned much of East Timor to the ground and killed another 1,000 Timorese, but they voted for their freedom. The UN would control it for 3 years, and then in May of 2002, we were able to go back to Timor, and that night did a broadcast, the day of their independence, and we called Noam. And Noam said, I never believed that this moment would come, telling us the truth, though it just showed how remarkable he was, because for all of those decades that he covered East Timor, that he wrote about East Timor, the fact that he said he did not really have hope that the people of East Timor would be free, and yet he continued to educate people all over the world. So it was just about midnight. Shanana Gusmao, been imprisoned by the Indonesian military for years, ascended the stage, speaking in 4 languages, would make Noam proud, putting everyone else to shame. And he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. There was a fireworks display. You could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the surviving people of East Timor. And we talked to Noam at that moment and thanked him.
You've interviewed him probably more than anyone else ever over the course of your time at the magazine. Can you just tell us, what is it that you think about his voice and his analysis is so powerful that caused you to bring him back to the program so many times because you think people need to hear it?
First of all, he not only was a great scholar, he was an activist. He, together with the great historian Howard Zinn, who wrote The People's History of the United States, protested, not only wrote about Vietnam, but protested the war in Vietnam. In fact, Noam said that at that time, he thought he could be imprisoned for the rest of his life. And he prepared with his wife, Carol, that could happen. He had 3 small children, but he was willing to take that risk. So he was an activist and a great scholar. And I think he brought that to our conversations through all those years. And his love also of book learning. I remember visiting Noam when he moved into his new offices at MIT. I think the architect said he actually had Noam in mind, the idea that Noam would be living in his building. Meanwhile, I couldn't say that, well, Noam was going nuts in this new office because I think the walls were all angled.
They were tilted.
And so they were tilted. He said, how am I supposed to put up bookshelves? I can't, it was just a place already in the old army barracks that he had his office in. I'm sure that you were there forever. Piles of books, but at least there were also bookshelves. He said, this is an impossibility. How could I be assigned to this office? His love of books, his love of the world, his deep optimism about the world, despite the horror of what he covered from Vietnam, and his consistency. Whether he was taking on in Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, and its occupation of and genocide in East Timor, or whether he was taking on Israel and taking on the occupation, taking on the slaughter there. He was extremely consistent. And he felt very clearly that his scholarship, his activism, this is what he could offer the world. And I think he served as a model to his own family and his own children and shaped them. And everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the sort of common misconceptions about Chomsky that you often wielded in bad faith is the idea that he's solely a critic of the United States government and is an apologist for other regimes. But actually, as I was combing through his life's work, you find him signing petitions all the time for dissidents in other countries, whether it's Turkey, whether he was criticizing Ortega in Nicaragua, or even criticizing Hugo Chavez at the point that he infringed civil liberties. Because as you pointed out, he was consistent in having a libertarian socialist approach that was critical of all authoritarianism wherever it popped up, and a friend to dissidents around the world. Greg, I'd love to bring you in here. Maybe you could talk about, if you could perhaps summarize what you think Professor Chomsky's kind of critique of a U.S. power is. If you could give us a little intro to what you think he contributes to our understanding of our country.
Well, it's multi-sided and it's quite complicated in many ways. But I think it's also important to point out that Noam Chomsky his work in linguistics is really, this is a terrific panel, but it would have been. We didn't get a linguist, which of course is what, in some ways, empowered Chomsky for 6 decades to be able to be consistent, to speak truth to power, even though I don't think he liked that.
They did like that phrase.
Power doesn't need it. But Chomsky's revolution in the field of linguistics, which is just ongoing in terms of its transformation of everything from analytical philosophy to artificial intelligence, was just off the charts, and that I think made him, despite the significant criticism that he faced for his insistence on holding the United States up to a standard, it allowed that kind of consistency throughout the course of his career. My understanding is that when I spoke to Noam, he kind of almost talked about his understanding of power as formed almost, entirely all at once, without, and it hadn't changed over time. It was formed during World War II, listening to Hitler on the radio, where he couldn't understand the German, but he could understand the tone of the voice and the menace. He grew up in a Jewish community and in the outskirts of Philadelphia, and his uncle, and he became political. He became an anarchist through the way he tells it, through his relationship with an uncle who brought him to New York, and he went to, sold papers on 72nd Street, right? Was it 72nd Street?
I was just going to say that, I was just passing 72nd Street the other day, and I always think of Noam. Between 72nd and 73rd, there is a newspaper stand. And then behind 72nd to 71st, there's a newspaper stand. Noam's uncle ran the one south of the subway station. And he said if he ran the one north of it, he would have never been educated as he was, because that one everyone ran and got newspapers and ran off. But behind it wasn't quite as popular. And so everyone would sit there or stand there, read the paper, discuss it. And he said it was where he was first politicized, like when he was 10 years old.
And there's that, and then apparently his uncle also took him to socialist and anarchist publishing houses in the Lower East Side, and he was exposed to a certain kind of worldview, which he claimed grounded him and framed his politics from the beginning. It was in the 1960s with Vietnam, I think he became more actively political, although I did find in a JSTOR search or a ProQuest search, I think his first published political opinion, it was an open letter to President Kennedy protesting the Bay of Pigs.
Oh,
You can actually read it, many of the signatures are, middle standard left liberals of the time, John Rawls and Stuart Hughes and Timothy Leary is on it, Lewis Mumford and Noam Chomsky, and the text, the letter to Kennedy is quite actually conservative. It accepts a lot of the terms of the Cold War. And I asked him once, I said, I asked him about that. He said, you have to understand the degree of repression and how dissent wasn't allowed in the early 1960s, so it had to be framed in those terms. And my understanding is that he was very active in not just in his teaching of linguistics and developing, even as he was developing his radical work in syntax and grammar, he was giving teachings on the escalation of the war in Vietnam. And that produced a book in 1969 of essays that had previously published essays called American Power and the New Mandarins. And that was the book that kind of put him, I think, catapulted him in the role of a kind of well-known and respected, because he hadn't yet been cast out of polite society because of, he was still being published by the New York Review of Books. And it was a critique of Cold War liberalism. It was a critique of the Cold War university, the Cold War establishment, the way that the range of choices are narrowed, that anybody who is outside of that range is turned into what he called a wild man in the wings, and dismissed and not talked about. And as time went on, in many ways, Noam was very consistent. He continued to hold the United States to a standard. Yes, he did critique the Soviet Union, and he did critique other regimes when he needed or when he was asked to sign a petition, but he did have an understanding of a hierarchy of power, and that determined responsibility and obligation, and hence his relentless focus on the United States. And the 1960s, as Vietnam kind of gave way to a myriad of covert operations everywhere in the Middle East, in East Timor, in Latin America, Chomsky continued to follow it. He became the preeminent anti-imperialist of this country, and I think one of his appeals is that he resisted a postmodern turn. He resisted a kind of introspective turn that a lot of academics made, where they started looking at the capillaries of power and the relations of individuals. He kept his eyes focused on the big picture, and I think that accounted for his ongoing appeal as time went on, and almost as a prophet, the things that things kept getting worse. I mean, the intervention, when he said this intervention will lead to a greater catastrophe, it inevitably did. He became involved in Latin America. He was very much interested. Mostly it was Vietnam and then the Middle East. His very first essay that he published as a student was a critique of the Zionist project. He said that Jews can't thrive in a partitioned land, and I think that was a position that he held throughout his life. And so he was focused on the Middle East, but he paid quite a bit of attention to an area that I work on in Latin America. By this point, a group of anthropologists and linguists around the greater MIT area had become involved in solidarity movements in Central America. And they linked up with Nicaraguan social scientists, and they basically helped create and helped nurture, during the Sandinistas, under state of war, under siege, the United States spending millions and millions of dollars to break the Sandinistas, a very vibrant anthropology community within Nicaragua that in turn helped the Sandinistas broker its relationship with the Atlantic coast, which is culturally and linguistically distinct. I think Chomsky in some ways was the center of that. A lot of people gravitated around him. He wasn't just an activist and he wasn't just a scholar, but he inspired other people to do work that had long-lasting consequences.
You and Amy have both touched there on something that I found very important since I was first exposed to him in high school, which is the kind of moral clarity of his work. There's so much information, so many issues that we're all deluged with at all times. And one of the refreshing things, kind of intellectually refreshing things, is when you read Chomsky, is everything seems very grounded in a clear set of moral priorities, as if he's asked the questions, well, okay, what really matters? What really matters is, human suffering, is abuse, is oppression, and what should we pay attention to? And what's noise? He filtered out the noise very, very quickly. He's very dismissive of a lot of things. When questions are asked to him that he thinks are frivolous, he waves them away. Well, you need to pay attention to particularly the threats in our time. One of the things that's heavily emphasized in the book, because you've talked about a lot in recent years, is the threats facing the world. The book is called, the subtitle is How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World, the climate crisis and nuclear war in particular. Victor, can I turn to you? Can I ask you, we've touched on many aspects for Mr. Chomsky's work, and we still haven't gotten to the media analysis, for which he is quite famous. So if you could maybe introduce the famous idea of manufacturing consent, to tell us a bit about Chomsky's kind of media analysis.
Sure. And I'm sure everyone in here has probably heard of manufacturing consent. Yes, we've all read it at some point, or at least flipped through it a bit, as I did on the train ride here from Philly earlier today. So manufacturing consent, I think it's fair to say, of course this is a book co-written with Ed Herman, who was a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. I think the two of them were grappling with one big question, which is how in societies such as ours are people coerced? Are people convinced to take on positions, often unpopular positions, that stem directly from elite interests? And in trying to address this question, and of course, at least in theory, in liberal, supposedly democratic societies where you don't have official censorship, unlike under authoritarian regimes where you have direct state repression, in societies such as ours, we're supposed to have freedom of expression, we're supposed to have diversity of opinions, the marketplace of ideas. But why is it that so often we do fall in line? And I think this is where obviously the media and propaganda come into play. And Ed and Noam tried to, of course they deliberately took this phrase, manufacturing consent, from the famed liberal journalist Walter Lippmann, who Nathan and Noam mentioned in the book. And by the way, I'll put a quick plug in for the book. It is it is a page turner. I got an advanced copy 5 days ago and I'm almost finished with it, so I highly recommend reading it. But you guys mentioned this about this influence that Walter Lippmann had on elite opinion, that essentially advanced democracies require propaganda. It's important, it's necessary to lead the, quote, bewildered herd, meaning all of us, towards the correct positions. And so in trying to make sense of how media are used as instruments of propaganda, they came up with a propaganda model, which was composed of 5 filters. And it's through these filters that media is produced, the power operates through media, that you end up with very predictable patterns of omission, selection, and emphasis. And 5 filters, some of them are fairly intuitive, and I'm sure we all probably remember them from our reading Manufactured Consent, but the first one is ownership. So that is the corporate and private ownership of our media. And of course, in many sectors, we're talking about a handful of corporations dominating our news media. But also importantly, it is the profit-driven nature of our media system. So the commercial nature of our media system is very important here. The second filter is advertising, which works as a de facto licensing authority for determining what kind of media, what sort of voices and views are actually expressed in our media system. I think these first 2 filters really determine a lot of what gets covered in our media. The third filter is around sourcing. So this over-reliance on official sources, business elites, political elites, oftentimes one leading Democratic politician, one leading Republican politician, and that's basically your news story right there. The fourth filter is flat, and so this is organized pressure groups, right-wing media activist groups. At the time that they wrote this book in 1988, it would be groups like Accuracy in Media, for example. And I think we can still see many examples of this today. And then the fifth filter would be the dominant ideology. In 1988, this was anti-communism. They later adapted this to anti-terrorism. Now I think it's most useful to see this filter as just the official narratives. Who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? Who are our official enemies? And I think that that's sort of overarching. Also, our feelings towards capitalism or the two-party system, just things that we never scrutinize. I think that would be the fifth filter. And again, so taken together, this propaganda model, these 5 filters, really determine the way a lot of important issues get covered in our media.
So let me ask you then, how would someone who has internalized Chomsky or Chomsky and Herman's insight about the media read the newspaper or watch the news? What kind of eye do you develop?
There are so many examples of where their model could be very useful. And I should, as a side note, it's quite tragic in my own field of communication, their work is often not used as centrally as I think it should be. But of course, the example that comes to everyone's mind is what's happening in Gaza today. And the method that Herman and Chomsky would use in writing Manufactured Consent, they would do these very systematic content analyses. And they would find 2 similar events or 2 similar controversies, ideally one dealing with one of our official allies, one dealing with one of our official enemies, and then just compare the way they get covered to really bring to light these ideological biases. So today, for example, we might look to see how Palestinians are being described versus how Israeli victims are being described or Ukrainian victims are being described. And it just so happens, again, the train ride in today, I read this new study that was just published in The Nation by Adam Johnson and Othman Ali that actually do this. They look at MSNBC and CNN to see how they're covering victims of military violence in these 3 countries. And not surprisingly, they find things, for example, the word genocide is used much more often in describing what's happening in the Ukraine compared to what's happening in Gaza. So just these very evidence-based, just looking at counting words, looking at how these catastrophes are being described in our mainstream media, that just really brings to light these biases.
Actually, Amy, can I bring you back here because obviously you have now run an independent news program for many decades where you have tried to correct for this kind of bias. And I noticed that the intro to your book is called "Going Where the Silence Is." So where do you think the silence is, and how do you try and fill it?
Well, following up on what you're saying, when you look at the coverage of Gaza, of the West Bank, of Lebanon, how often, and I'm not talking about Fox, I'm talking about CNN, I'm talking about MSNBC. When was the last time you saw a Palestinian interviewed who is, at the target end of, sadly, U.S. policy, because the U.S. is providing the weapons to Israel? I mean, you rarely ever see someone interviewed. I can't think of a time I recently saw that. I can't say never because I don't watch it all the time, but it is my job to see how the media constructs a story. It's our job to then deconstruct that if there is a problem with it. Yes, it's our job in the media to go to where the silence is, and it is often not silent. It is raucous, people are speaking, they are organizing, but it just doesn't hit the corporate media radar.
I want to get to questions because we want to conclude by 7:45, but perhaps we could just conclude each with a quick couple of remarks on what you think are takeaway, or what you think people ought to take away from Chomsky's work. Maybe you could go first and we could just pass.
I'd like to hear what Bev says first.
Oh yeah, let's hear it. Let's hear it.
I wasn't quite ready.
What do you think takeaway?
Well, my role in Noam's life was very different. I mean, I'm hearing all of this, and I lived it with him, and I watched it happen, a lot of it since 1993, not all of it. But I would say that one thing that Noam needed with all of this, you can imagine him working on this day and night, was humor. So I think my job became, because I decided it should be, to bring humor to his life. He would look at the day's schedule and he would say, Bev, because my name was never Bev, it was Bev. Can we count our thoughts? And I'd say, I'd give him some lame answer. And I didn't answer that question actually until after we traveled with him, and he did a talk on language and mind in Italy. And I said, no, we can't count our thoughts because nobody knows what thought is. Nobody knows what the mind is. And he actually raises his hand to that. So I think as far as thinking goes, he was always thinking. He never stopped thinking. Even when he was thinking about thinking, he was thinking. And one day I said to him, how do you deal with the people who who write to you and write these nasty things? Because not everybody loved Noam. They were wrong, but not everybody loved Noam. And he'd say to me things like, and everything was a puzzle with him. We had great fun. I mean, I really liked that I could provide that for him. But he'd say, people are hurricanes. I'd say, oh God, what does that mean? And he'd say, people are hurricanes. And then I'd leave his office and think about it, and then I'd come and trick him into answering it for me. And he'd say, you can't control a hurricane. You can't control people. You just have to wait it out. So, I have a million, we joked about his Jewish mother and my Catholic mother and which one instilled the most guilt. And I told him about the fact that my mother would make me stick my tongue out, and if there was a black mark, that meant I was lying. So Noam would say to me, could you write to these people and you can check my tongue when I come in. So.
And people should really pick up. If you haven't read Bev's book, it is delightful. If you want to know and I think one of the things that you bring across it in the book is the warmth of the real Noam Chomsky, which does not always. If people have just heard his thoughts on the current crisis in the Middle East, or they have read his books, they don't quite get that.
Yeah, I saw the protection. He protected people. He might have spoken the truth, and that was all he was about. But he was also very careful. He thought everybody should be listened to. One of the last things I asked him in my book was, why did you do it? Why did you answer every single email that came to you? I can't tell you what I said because it's the end of the book. But let's just say he has a lot of respect.
There's the why, and then there's the how, which I'm still mystified by how he answered.
Right. And one last thing I want to say to what Amy said about the piles of books. and how he said there's no place to put them. He put them on top of his desk in front of the window that Frank Gehry had specifically designed for him to look out at the Boston skyline. So you looked at the Boston skyline, all you saw were books.
So, Victor, any concluding thoughts on the takeaway that you have from Chomsky's body of work?
Sure, and I'll pick up on a couple of these themes because I do really think that his generosity is so pervasive in everything that he did, and not just emailing, not just replying to all the emails, but also endorsing everyone's book and actually reading the books. Like that's the part that surprised me the most when he was blurbing my books. But I do think, and this picks up on something that Amy said earlier, that it is somewhat counterintuitive that he was actually so optimistic. And I had the opportunity to interview Noam about 3 years ago for The Nation magazine. And that was something in his, he was talking about worthy and unworthy victims and all these very depressing topics that he read in the paper that morning. He woke up every morning and that was the first thing that he would do, was to read the elite media and already start generating a media critique for that day. But he also, after all these years, had seen such progress. And that really jumped out at me, this idea that he had actually seen progress, and he attributed it to social forces from below, that social movements had shifted these media narratives. I think that's really important to hold on to.
I guess, as a model to aspire to, I think certainly his humility, his generosity, his insistence on the decency of human beings, on everybody, and on the quality of work of everybody. I think that was the foundation of his ethics, that everybody is equally worthy of dignity, of a dignified life, and looking at the power systems that prevent that from becoming to fruition. I think that his skepticism, his raised eyebrow when it comes to power, when it comes to detecting bullshit, if you watch some of you on YouTube and you watch his debates with William Buckley, you can, he's being respectful and he's answering the questions, but you can tell that he thinks Buckley's he thinks Buckley is a clown, and yet he treats him decently and he answers his questions, but he has a sharp antenna for double speak and for double standards. And I guess the only other thing I'd say, he always inevitably denies that there's a relationship between his linguistic structures and scholarship and his ethics and his politics. And I guess if he says that's true, I guess that's true. But I don't know that much about linguistics, but my understanding is that one of the basic principles of Chomskyan linguistics is the idea that there's an infinite amount of data out there, and we as finite beings, right, can't have access to all of that information, and yet we're able to create these moral systems from, and it's almost a humility to that framework, right? That we as finite beings that are infinitely creative, but can't have access to the plurality of data and university and infinite amount of data that exists in the universe, and yet we're still able to create moral meaning from it. And I think that ultimately is the essence of his politics too. He always seemed very humble to me, and what he insisted on was the obvious, the obvious double standards, the obvious double speaks, the obvious, justifications for power and barbarism, and pointing it out, and pointing it out in a relentless kind of, in some ways I think of him as Walter Benjamin's angel of history. He keeps his eye, he just sees the catastrophes piling up, and he just keeps going.
Noam was almost never quoted on the front page of the New York Times, although I think maybe it was in the book review. They talked about him as one of the great intellectuals of our time, to which he responded, "What did I say wrong?" I think he taught us here, especially in the United States, what an awesome responsibility we have as people who come from the most powerful country on earth. That gives us a kind of protection, and we have to use that protection because we have to expose what the United States is doing in other parts of the world, and he never shied away from that. He is a man of great compassion. I mean, the way he took care of his first wife, Carol, who died of brain cancer, and I'm sure Bev could talk about that, to the end, tending to her was so deeply beautiful and humbling. And his great sense of egalitarianism, as everyone describes, answering all his emails, being tireless in really ultimately his optimism that people can make a difference if they keep at it.
Yeah, I every time I don't answer an email, I think to myself, Noam Chomsky would be answering all of his emails. I think a lot about the model. We've talked a lot tonight about Professor Chomsky, about his work, his life, why we've been personally inspired by him, the way he's touched other people. But he wasn't very he has been, a very self-deprecating person. And someone who constantly is uncomfortable with being celebrated as we have. And I think would always want us to draw attention to the issues that he writes about, the very, very serious problems facing humankind and our obligations as people, as you said, as people with privilege, as people who live in this country, our obligations, our duties. And I think, we can read, I think we can and should, read his work, internalize the facts that he documented that nobody else documented, and, not take away just an uncritical celebration of the great Noam Chomsky, but also a model of how each of us can be engaged with the most important struggles of our time. So thank you so much to our wonderful panel. We're going to have a little bit of time for questions. There's a few minutes for questions if anybody has questions.
This isn't a question, it's a further remark. I was married to a colleague of Noam's named Louis Kampf. My name is Ellen Quintero. And so I knew Noam from, 1964 on, and I deeply agree with what everybody has said, his warmth, his compassion, his generosity, his kindness. What hasn't been said and what might seem obvious, Louis said to me early on in our relationship, he said, I have only ever met one genius, and that is Noam Chomsky. And then he said, I've watched him read a book. And he goes, he reads 60 pages a minute and remembers everything and remembers where it was, in which paragraph, on which page. Which means that I don't think, his moral stance, his moral perspective is a model for us. But he can't be a model for us because we don't have that kind of brain. He influenced me. I read Peace in the Middle East, went to Israel, kept going there and reporting on the West Bank and Israel's occupation of it from 1979, and I'm still writing about it. So he changed my life. I'm just one of millions and millions.
Hi, I'm Jesse Tendler. Just wanted to say thank you, and also one of the things that hasn't been talked about yet, hasn't been touched on. We've talked about the media elite and just dealing with the elite in politics, but there's this new trend in recent years of vilifying the academic elite, And I was wondering if you could talk about Chomsky's opinion on that and your own opinions on that as well, since I think that's a really important issue in dealing with how people absorb Chomsky's teachings and all of the information that we're trying to disseminate.
That's a very interesting question because in some ways Chomsky himself is very critical of the academic elite and the first major essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, is in many ways an indictment of the academic elite, but for the right reasons. And I had great respect for serious scholarship. Maybe Greg, you're within the academy. Maybe you could.
Well, Amy just wanted to say
Just
goodbye.
have to say goodbye and to head to Washington. We're going to do the show from there. But I also wanted to encourage people to just go to democracynow.org and just see the interviews with Noam from 1996 to today. And also, I wanted to congratulate you, Nathan, on your superb book and how exciting it is that it is out right now.
I wanted to ask you, do you know how many interviews you did total with him?
I don't. Now I'm going to have to
You got
check
lots
on the
of-
train down to Washington.
200.
Exactly.
It's a little, yeah, it's a very rough number.
Thanks so much for joining us, Amy.
Bye, Amy. I don't really have anything profound to say to that, except that it does index, I think, the evolution of U.S. politics. When Chomsky began writing political theory and political work in the 1960s, his focus was on the Cold War University as a site of power production, right? American Mandarins, what's the name of the book? I said it earlier.
American Power, the new.
American Power, the new Mandarins, right? The ways in which academic elites were part of the production of Cold War power. And obviously we've come a long way where scholars and universities are under siege by an insurgent new right that wants to do away with universities altogether, if not do away with them, then at least turn them into, I don't know what they want to turn them into. So that it does kind of, it does kind of index the evolution of US politics and the rise of the right that came after that first phase of Chomsky's writing.
I see a question.
Can I add just one
Please.
bit to that that sort of picks up on both the question but also what you were saying, Nathan, which is because Noam was clearly very critical of the academy as an institution, and one of my questions for him when I interviewed him was about this idea in the popular imagination that campuses are overrun with left-wing radicals. And we were both talking about how in actuality these are fairly liberal institutions, and liberal in the international sense of being fairly centrist and maybe aligned with the Democratic Party, but not even really social democratic. So there's an interesting disconnect about it's almost we only wish it were as radical as we are often made out to be, but not to take away from the very real threat of we are under more and more attack from far right-wing forces.
I've heard here tonight and often what's spoken of about Chomsky is his great consistency over time. And I mean, he's lived such a long life as a public intellectual. If you equal him, I think he's shockingly the same age as Habermas. But I'm curious for anyone to answer what changed. How do you see, what would you identify as something that really moved his thinking or something he really moved on over time that strikes you?
I mean, I'll just say that he said if you asked him that question, he would say nothing. One time, I said, the Cuban Revolution influenced a lot of new left thinkers. Everybody saw William Aberman Williams, C. Wright Mills. They all wrote little books about the Cuban Revolution because they thought it overcame some problem, one or the other. I said, were you moved by the Cuban Revolution? He said, not really. And then he went back to the 30s and said, and so there was a remarkable consistency and stubbornness. He was very analytical. He was very wedded. He was very critical of not just postmodernism, but any kind of metaphysical Marxism. He constantly criticized the concept of the dialectic. He said it either means something very simple or nothing at all. And he would say these things over and over, and you'd find these quotations over the course of his thing. So, I mean, I'm sure he evolved over time and was attuned to the fact that it wasn't the technocratic liberal elite that was setting the agenda anymore, but an insurgent, scary right. And I think his willingness to constantly urge people to vote for the Democratic Party, because of a greater danger, might have been a change in his political strategy and political thinking.
Yeah, Zach, I'll leave it. Just real fast. I just wanted to say that every June when Noam packed up, and he touched so many lives and so many people worked with him, he would sigh and say, I don't think anything that I did this year made a difference. And I would just look at him and shake my head, and I'd have to sort of lift him up, and Carol would do the same thing. You are making a difference. You're teaching a lot of people how to do this work, and you're speaking the truth. And one thing that I really think is important to say is that when I started, you mentioned my blog earlier, and that's the reason I wrote the book. When activists read my blog, they said, wait a minute, Noam Chomsky has a life. Noam Chomsky has a boat, he has grandchildren that he plays with. And Alex Carey, there are lots of activists who've committed suicide, very depressed people, because they're looking at this stuff 24/7. And when they found out that he actually tried to have a life, a real life away from all of this, he had to balance himself. Then other activists would say, then I guess it's okay for me to spend a Sunday with my family. And I think that was important.
Very quickly.
Yes.
Just going back to something that I said earlier, but I really do think he recognized that media had changed, both in good and troubling ways. The good part, again, was this idea that the example he gave was even the imperfect 1619 project of the New York Times, and just the coverage of race and various issues that 20, 30, 40 years ago would have been beyond imagination. That they would cover these issues in these particular ways. But on the other hand, he was very disappointed or troubled by the collapse of the newspaper industry and how we've lost 2/3 of our newspaper journalists since the early 2000s, and he thought that's a very very problematic issue for us if we want to try to democratize the media in any significant way.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is a question, but I would love to hear your thoughts. Like some of those things about the attacks on academia by far right and all of that, I want to say that a lot of the problem in academia is actually this kind of political economy that it is working out like corporations. So a lot of people who want to not be necessarily Noam Chomsky, but the dissidents, have dissident voices in humanities, they are kind of pushed out bit by bit starting graduate school. So when I was in graduate school, I saw that's how bit by bit students are getting kicked out if they are not falling in line. And then when I become a professor, I saw that's how junior scholars are getting kicked out. And how a lot of us are actually precariously employed. And I visited Noam Chomsky's archive in Cambridge, and I saw that this is a person that is obviously reading everything and has time and security to do all of these things. I'm not sure how many academics have that opportunity these days. The incomes are really low, and most PhDs don't even get a job. And so it's important, I think, that's to also understand that it's easy to attack far right and all of that. It's more difficult to understand that how our whole university system is actually causing not having a public intellectual like Noam Chomsky anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's I'm also someone who's went to graduate school and then realized that actually being a professor would not allow for the level of freedom to do the kind of the work that I thought was valuable, which is why I now run a magazine. I don't think he would disagree with any of the points you made about what is sometimes called the neoliberalization of the university. Very very important to draw attention to the conditions under which knowledge can or is not produced, can be or is not produced.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs Magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs Podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.